"Your Honor, please, I'm begging you. He's going to kill my babies. He told me he would rather see them dead than let me have them. Please, you have to listen to me." The judge barely looked up from his paperwork as he denied Jennifer Dean's emergency protective order request for the third time in 2 months. "Ma'am, you need evidence, not hysteria. Mr. Dean has rights too." 48 hours later, 8-year-old Emma, 6-year-old Sophie, and 4-year-old Grace Dean were found shot to death in their beds, their father's suicide note confessing to the murders he'd threatened all along. The same judge who dismissed Jennifer's hysterical pleas would later tell reporters he had followed proper legal procedures, even as 3 little girls' blood stained the very system that was supposed to protect them. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the complete failure of everyone who had the power to prevent it, but chose procedure over protection. Judge Harold Whitman set down his coffee cup and reached for the next file in his stack that Tuesday morning in October, treating Jennifer Dean's third emergency petition like routine paperwork. He'd been on the family court bench for 18 years, and he'd heard it all before: bitter divorces, custody battles, accusations flying back and forth between angry ex-spouses. What he saw was a desperate woman making increasingly frantic claims about her estranged husband, a respected insurance agent who showed up to court in pressed suits and spoke respectfully to the bailiffs. What he didn't see was a mother who had stopped sleeping because she was terrified of the phone calls that came at 3 a.m., the ones where David Dean would whisper exactly how he planned to make her pay for leaving him. He didn't see the woman who had started keeping her daughter's overnight bags packed by the front door, ready to run at a moment's notice. He couldn't hear the coldness in David's voice when he told Jennifer, "If I can't have my family, nobody can." Jennifer Dean had been fighting for her daughters' lives for 8 months, ever since she'd finally gathered the courage to leave the man who had controlled every aspect of their marriage for 12 years. David Dean presented well in public. He coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, and had never been arrested. But behind closed doors, he was a man who punched holes in walls when dinner was late, who told his wife she was worthless without him, and who had recently begun making chilling statements about what he would do if she ever tried to take his children away from him. The custody arrangement, ordered by Judge Whitman himself, gave David overnight visitation every other weekend, despite Jennifer's repeated warnings that he was becoming increasingly unstable. "The children need their father," the judge had said, dismissing Jennifer's concerns as the typical complaints of a vindictive ex-wife trying to weaponize the children against her former husband. But mothers know. They know when something is wrong with the person they lived with, slept beside, and watched interact with their children for years. Jennifer Dean knew her ex-husband better than anyone in that courtroom, and she knew he was capable of following through on his threats. She just couldn't make anyone else believe her. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday for Jennifer Dean. She dropped the girls off at school, Emma at the elementary school, Sophie at the kindergarten center, and Grace at preschool, kissing each of them goodbye and reminding them she'd see them after work. David was supposed to pick them up that afternoon for his scheduled visitation, and Jennifer had that familiar knot in her stomach that came every time she had to hand her daughters over to a man who had promised to destroy them all. By 6 p.m., when David didn't return her calls asking about dinner arrangements for the girls, Jennifer's worry turned to panic. By 8 p.m., when her calls went straight to voicemail, she was driving to his apartment complex. By 8:30 p.m., when police broke down David Dean's door, it was already too late. But how did we get here? And why didn't anyone listen when it mattered most? To understand the magnitude of what was lost that October evening, you have to understand what the Dean family had been before David's need for control consumed everything in its path. Jennifer and David had met at a church social when she was 24 and he was 28, both seemingly looking for the same thing: a stable partner to build a traditional family with. Jennifer Crawford Dean had grown up in a loving home where her parents modeled healthy relationships and mutual respect. She worked as a dental hygienist and dreamed of having children who would grow up feeling safe and cherished the way she had. David appeared to share those values, at least initially. He was financially stable, talked about wanting a large family, and seemed to adore Jennifer's gentle, nurturing nature. Their wedding in May 2008 was everything Jennifer had dreamed of, a small ceremony in her childhood church, surrounded by family and friends who believed they were watching the beginning of a beautiful love story. David was attentive and romantic during their courtship, bringing Jennifer flowers, opening doors for her, and treating her with what seemed like old-fashioned respect and chivalry. Emma arrived 2 years later, a perfect baby with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. Jennifer had never experienced love like what she felt holding her daughter for the first time, and watching David cradle Emma with such tenderness made her believe they had created something precious together. Sophie followed 2 years after that, and then Grace completed their family in 2016. For the first few years of their marriage, David seemed to be the devoted husband and father Jennifer had hoped for. He worked long hours to provide for his growing family, coached Emma's soccer team, and took pride in having what he called his girls. Neighbors would later describe them as the picture-perfect family, attractive, financially stable, active in their community and church. But even during those early years, Jennifer began noticing things that troubled her. David's need to control small details of their daily life, his anger when she made decisions without consulting him first, his insistence that she account for every minute of her day when he wasn't home. At first, she explained it away as his way of showing he cared about his family. She told herself that his jealousy meant he loved her, that his need to know where she was at all times was protectiveness, not possession. The first time David grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, Emma was 3, and Sophie was just a baby. Jennifer had taken the girls to visit her mother without telling David first, and he was furious when they returned home. "You don't make decisions about my children without asking me," he said, his grip tightening as he spoke. "Do you understand me?" Jennifer was so shocked by his sudden violence that she couldn't speak, could only nod as tears filled her eyes. That night, after David had gone to bed as if nothing had happened, Jennifer stood in her daughter's nursery, watching them sleep, and promised herself she would never let them see their father hurt her. It was a promise she would struggle to keep as David's need for control grew stronger with each passing year. By 2018, the mask was slipping more frequently. David monitored Jennifer's phone calls, controlled their finances completely, and flew into rages over imagined slights and perceived disobedience. He never hit the girls, but they began to walk on eggshells around him, sensing his volatility even when Jennifer tried to shield them from the worst of his anger. Emma, always perceptive, began asking why Daddy was angry so much. Sophie started having nightmares and wetting the bed. Grace, still a toddler, would hide behind Jennifer's legs when David's voice got loud. Jennifer watched her daughter's natural childhood joy being slowly crushed by their father's unpredictable moods, and she knew she had to find a way to protect them. But leaving David Dean would prove to be the most dangerous decision Jennifer ever made. The final straw came on a February evening in 2019 when David, enraged that dinner was 15 minutes late, swept all the plates off the dining room table in a violent tantrum. As glass shattered across the kitchen floor and the girls cowered in fear, David turned to Jennifer with cold eyes and said the words that would haunt her forever. "If you ever try to leave me, I'll kill you all before I let another man raise my children. Do you hear me? I'd rather see them dead than lose them." Emma was old enough to understand the threat. Jennifer saw the terror in her daughter's eyes and knew she couldn't protect her children by staying any longer. That night she began planning their escape. Remember that 911 call from the beginning? We're about to understand why she was so desperate. Jennifer Dean's first call to the domestic violence hotline came at 2 a.m. on a cold March morning, 3 weeks after David's threat to kill them all. She whispered into the phone while hiding in her bathroom, afraid to wake him, afraid to be caught seeking help. The counselor on the other end of the line told her something that would echo in her mind for months to come. The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave. You need to plan carefully, and you need to document everything. Documentation, evidence, proof. These became Jennifer's obsessions as she began building a case that she hoped would protect her daughters from their father's escalating threats. She started keeping a journal, writing down every incident, every threat, every moment when David's behavior made her fear for their safety. She took photos of the bruises on her arms, recorded some of his late-night phone calls, and saved the threatening text messages he sent when she didn't respond quickly enough to his communications. But gathering evidence meant staying in danger longer, and Jennifer watched her daughters paying the price for her caution. Emma developed anxiety so severe she was having panic attacks at school. Sophie stopped talking to her friends and spent most of her time trying to be invisible. Grace, sensing the tension in their home, became clingy and fearful, crying whenever Jennifer left her sight. The decision to leave came in May 2019, after David shoved Jennifer so hard she fell down the stairs while holding Grace. As she lay at the bottom of the staircase with her crying toddler, Jennifer realized that documenting David's abuse was pointless if she didn't live long enough to use it. That night, while David was at work, she packed what they could carry and took the girls to a domestic violence shelter an hour away. David's reaction was swift and terrifying. Within hours of discovering they were gone, he was calling Jennifer's phone non-stop, leaving voicemails that alternated between sobbing apologies and death threats. "You can't take my children from me," he said in one message. "I'll find you, and when I do, you'll pay for this. All of you will pay." The shelter helped Jennifer file for a protective order and connected her with a legal aid attorney who would represent her in the custody proceedings. But Jennifer quickly learned that the family court system operates on different rules than the criminal justice system. In criminal court, David's threats and history of violence would be taken seriously. In family court, they were just allegations that needed to be proven, and proving emotional abuse and threats is nearly impossible when the perpetrator presents well in public. Judge Harold Whitman was assigned to the Dean custody case, and from their first hearing, Jennifer could tell he was skeptical of her claims. David showed up to court in expensive suits, spoke respectfully to court personnel, and presented himself as a loving father who just wanted time with his children. Jennifer, still traumatized and struggling financially, appeared nervous and emotional, which Judge Whitman seemed to interpret as instability rather than fear. "Mrs. Dean," the judge said during their second hearing, "I understand you've had marital difficulties, but children need both parents. Mr. Dean has never been convicted of any crime against you or the children. These are serious allegations you're making, and without substantial proof, I have to consider what's in the best interests of the children." What Jennifer wanted to scream was that her children's best interest was never being alone with their father again. What she said, through tears, was, "Your Honor, he threatened to kill us. I have recordings." "Recordings that could be taken out of context," Judge Whitman interrupted. "I'm ordering supervised visitation to start immediately. Mr. Dean has rights as a father." The supervised visits at the Family Services Center were Jennifer's first glimpse of hope in months. With a social worker present, David was forced to control his behavior, and the girls began to relax during these limited interactions with their father. Emma started smiling again, Sophie's nightmares decreased, and Grace began playing normally instead of constantly watching for signs of danger. But David was furious about the supervision requirement and the limited time it allowed him with his daughters. His phone calls to Jennifer became increasingly threatening. "This isn't over," he would tell her. "You think you've won something, but you haven't. Those are my children, and I will have them back." Jennifer dutifully reported each threatening call to her attorney, who filed motion after motion, asking the court to take David's escalating behavior seriously. But Judge Whitman seemed more concerned with David's rights as a father than with the family's safety. After 3 months of supervised visits with no incidents, he ordered the supervision to be dropped and granted David overnight visitation every other weekend. "Your Honor, please," Jennifer begged during the hearing. "He's getting worse, not better. Last week, he followed me to the grocery store and confronted me in the parking lot. He said if he couldn't have his family, nobody could. Please, I'm begging you to listen to me." Judge Whitman barely looked up from his paperwork. "Mrs. Dean, Mr. Dean followed the rules during supervised visitation. He's entitled to normal parenting time with his children. These vague threats you're reporting aren't sufficient grounds to deny him his rights." That night, Jennifer held her 3 daughters close and promised them they would be safe during their visits with Daddy, even though she didn't believe it herself. Emma, now 8 years old and wise beyond her years, looked at her mother with solemn eyes and said, "Mommy, I don't want to go to Daddy's house. He scares me." Jennifer called her attorney the next morning to report Emma's statement, but was told that children's preferences weren't given much weight in custody decisions, especially when they might be influenced by an alienating mother. The system that was supposed to protect her daughters was instead setting them up for destruction, and Jennifer felt powerless to stop it. The first overnight visit passed without incident, and Jennifer allowed herself a moment of hope that perhaps David was learning to control his anger for the sake of their daughters. But the second visit included a phone call from Emma, whispering that Daddy was drinking and saying scary things about Mommy. When Jennifer called David's apartment to check on the girls, he answered with a voice full of rage. "You don't get to check up on me during my time," he said. "These are my children and I'll raise them however I see fit. And Jennifer, you need to remember who you're dealing with. I know where you work, where you live, where the girls go to school. Don't push me." Jennifer spent that night sitting in her car outside David's apartment building, unable to sleep, watching the windows and praying her daughters were safe until morning. When David dropped them off Sunday evening, all 3 girls were quiet and withdrawn. Grace had regressed to thumb-sucking, Sophie wouldn't let Jennifer out of her sight, and Emma asked if they could move far away where Daddy couldn't find them. The reports Jennifer made to Child Protective Services, the police and the family court were all met with the same response. Without evidence of actual physical harm to the children, there was nothing they could do. David's threats were considered he said, she said situations, and his exemplary behavior during the early supervised visits worked in his favor. By September 2019, Jennifer had filed for emergency protective orders 3 times, each one denied by Judge Whitman. She had contacted Child Protective Services 6 times, begging them to investigate David's treatment of the girls during visits. She had called the police 4 times to report threatening phone calls and twice to report David following her. Each agency told her the same thing. They couldn't act on threats alone. The weekend before the murders, Emma came home from visitation with a bruise on her arm that she said came from Daddy grabbing her when she tried to call Mommy. Jennifer photographed the bruise, documented Emma's explanation and filed another emergency motion with the court. Judge Whitman scheduled a hearing for the following Thursday, 2 days after David Dean would kill all 3 girls rather than lose custody of them. "Your Honor, please," Jennifer had pleaded during her final court appearance, the desperation clear in her voice. "He's escalating. He's hurting Emma now. He told me he would rather see them dead than let me have them. Please, you have to listen to me." Judge Whitman's response would haunt everyone who heard it. "Ma'am, you need evidence, not hysteria. Mr. Dean has rights too." She made one final plea to save her daughters. The judge's response would haunt everyone in that courtroom. If this story is hitting close to home, you need to see how it ends. Keep watching. The last text message Jennifer Dean ever received from her daughter Emma came at 4:47 p.m. on October 15th. "Daddy is acting scary again. Can you come get us?" Jennifer was still in traffic, rushing from her job at the dental office to pick up the girls from their father's apartment for what was supposed to be a regular custody exchange. She tried calling Emma's phone immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried David's number next, but he didn't answer either. What Jennifer didn't know was that David Dean had already made his final decision. The court hearing scheduled for Thursday, where Jennifer planned to present Emma's bruise and testimony about David's escalating violence, had pushed him over the edge. He couldn't risk losing custody completely, couldn't bear the thought of his daughters growing up to hate him the way their mother did. In his twisted logic, murder was preferable to abandonment. David had spent the afternoon drinking and brooding, working himself into a rage, while the girls tried to stay quiet in the living room, watching cartoons and hoping Daddy's mood would improve. He'd been talking to himself, muttering about Jennifer and her lies, and how she was trying to turn his children against him. Emma, mature beyond her 8 years, had recognized the signs of one of Daddy's worst episodes and sent that final, desperate text to her mother. At 5:15 p.m., David Dean walked into his daughter's bedroom, carrying the gun he'd purchased legally 3 weeks earlier. Emma was helping Sophie with a coloring book while Grace napped on the bed they all shared during their visits. According to the police report, Emma had time to say "Daddy, no" before David shot her first, then Sophie, then Grace. He saved a bullet for himself, but couldn't go through with his own suicide, calling 911 instead to confess what he'd done. The 911 call, played later during his trial, chilled everyone who heard it. David Dean's voice was calm, almost businesslike, as he told the dispatcher, "I just shot my 3 daughters. They're all dead. I couldn't let their mother have them." When asked if he was injured, he replied, "No, I changed my mind about that part. I guess I'll have to face what I've done." Jennifer arrived at David's apartment complex at 5:45 p.m. to find police cars and ambulances blocking the entrance. Her first thought was that there had been an accident, that maybe one of the girls had been hurt and David had called for help. It wasn't until she saw Detective Maria Santos walking toward her with that expression, the one every parent recognizes instinctively as the harbinger of unthinkable news, that Jennifer understood her worst fears had come true. "Mrs. Dean, I need you to sit down," Detective Santos said gently, taking Jennifer's arm and leading her to a bench beside the apartment complex's courtyard. "There's been an incident involving your daughters." Jennifer would later say that the moment Detective Santos spoke those words, her soul left her body. Some part of her had been preparing for this call since the first time David threatened to kill them all, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of losing all 3 of her children in a single moment of their father's rage. The crime scene that investigators processed that evening told the story of a man who had planned this act of ultimate control. David had closed the bedroom curtains, turned off the girls' cartoons, and positioned their bodies carefully after shooting them, covering each child with a blanket, as if tucking them in for eternal sleep. The gun was found on the nightstand, beside a handwritten note that read, "Jennifer, you did this. You made me choose between losing them and losing them forever. I chose forever." The community response was immediate and devastating. Emma's teacher broke down during a television interview, describing a bright, caring child who had recently started having trouble concentrating in school. Sophie's kindergarten teacher spoke about a little girl who used to love singing but had become quiet and withdrawn in recent weeks. Grace's preschool teacher remembered a happy toddler who had started clinging to her teachers and crying when her parents came for pickup. But the most haunting responses came from the professionals who had dismissed Jennifer's warnings. The Child Protective Services worker who had closed Jennifer's reports for lack of evidence requested a transfer to a different department. The police officer who had told Jennifer that threats weren't actionable until someone got hurt took early retirement. And Judge Harold Whitman, faced with the reality that his decisions had contributed to 3 children's deaths, issued a brief statement about following proper legal procedures and refused to comment further. Every red flag she'd tried to warn them about was now evidence in a case that would never bring her daughters back. The investigation that followed revealed the systematic failures that had led to this preventable tragedy. David Dean's threatening phone calls, documented by Jennifer and dismissed by the courts, were found on his phone along with detailed plans for the murders he'd been contemplating for weeks. His internet search history showed research into custody laws, gun purchases, and suicide methods. Most chilling of all were the journal entries he'd kept, describing his growing obsession with maintaining control over his daughters and his conviction that killing them was preferable to losing them to their mother. Detective Santos, who had worked family violence cases for 15 years, told reporters that she'd never seen such clear warning signs ignored by so many different systems. "This mother did everything right," she said. "She documented the abuse, she reported the threats, she begged for help. The system failed her and those children catastrophically." The medical examiner's report, while sparing in its details out of respect for the family, confirmed that all 3 girls had died quickly and likely without suffering. It was small comfort to a mother who would spend the rest of her life wondering if her daughters had been afraid, if they had called for her, if she could have somehow saved them if she'd just tried harder to make someone listen. But this mother wasn't done fighting. What she did next would change everything. David Dean's trial began 8 months after he murdered his daughters, and from the first day of jury selection, It was clear that this case had shaken the entire community. Potential jurors broke down in tears when asked if they could be impartial, and several had to be excused because they knew the family personally or had followed the case too closely in local media. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Mack, built their case around a simple premise. David Dean had committed the ultimate act of domestic violence, using his children as weapons to punish his ex-wife for leaving him. This wasn't a crime of passion, Mack told the jury during opening statements. This was calculated, premeditated murder designed to inflict maximum pain on the woman he could no longer control. The evidence was overwhelming. David's threatening phone calls, his internet search history, his journal entries planning the murders, all painted the picture of a man who had decided that if he couldn't have his family, he would destroy them completely. The prosecution presented testimony from domestic violence experts explaining how David's behavior fit the classic pattern of an abuser, escalating to lethal violence when faced with losing control. But it was Jennifer Dean's testimony that provided the most powerful moment of the trial. Taking the stand in a black dress and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, Jennifer walked the jury through months of ignored warnings and dismissed fears. She described the phone calls where David threatened to kill them all, the court appearances where judges treated her concerns as hysteria, and the growing terror she'd felt every time she had to hand her daughters over for visitation. "I knew he was going to hurt them," Jennifer testified, tears streaming down her face. "I begged everyone who would listen. I filed reports. I showed them bruises. I played them recordings of his threats. But no one would believe me until it was too late. My babies are gone because the people who were supposed to protect them thought his rights as a father were more important than their rights to live." The defense attorney, faced with his client's confession and overwhelming evidence of premeditation, attempted to argue that David had suffered a psychological break brought on by the stress of divorce and custody proceedings. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about his mental state, trying to present him as a man driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond his control. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. David Dean had functioned normally in every other aspect of his life during the months leading up to the murders. He'd gone to work, paid his bills, maintained relationships with friends and colleagues. His psychological break, if it had occurred at all, was remarkably selective, affecting only his treatment of the family he was losing control over. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for the threats against Jennifer. Judge Patricia Williams, who had replaced Judge Whitman on the case after his recusal, sentenced David Dean to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crimes an act of pure evil disguised as paternal love. But for Jennifer Dean, the legal victory was hollow. No sentence could bring back Emma, Sophie, and Grace, and no punishment could ease the guilt she felt about not being able to protect them. The real justice, she realized, would have to come in the form of changes to the system that had failed them so catastrophically. That desperate plea from the beginning? It would echo in courtrooms for years to come. Jennifer's advocacy began before David's trial had even ended. Working with domestic violence organizations and legal reform groups, she began speaking publicly about the failures that had led to her daughter's deaths. Her first speech, delivered at a conference for family court judges, was met with uncomfortable silence as she detailed how their procedures and biases had contributed to preventable murders. "You failed my children," she told the assembled judges. "You took a man's word over a mother's warnings because it was easier than doing the hard work of protecting victims. Emma, Sophie, and Grace died because you valued David Dean's parental rights more than their right to live." The impact of Jennifer's advocacy was swift and significant. The state legislature passed Emma's law within 6 months of her daughter's deaths, requiring family court judges to receive mandatory training on domestic violence dynamics and coercive control. The law also established new protocols for handling custody cases involving documented threats or abuse, including automatic emergency hearings and temporary protective measures. Judge Harold Whitman, whose dismissal of Jennifer's warnings had directly contributed to the tragedy, was removed from family court by the State Judicial Review Board and eventually resigned from the bench entirely. His replacement implemented new procedures requiring all threats of violence to be investigated by court-appointed advocates before custody decisions were made. Child Protective Services overhauled their response protocols after an internal investigation revealed that Jennifer's reports had been minimized and dismissed because they came from a woman involved in a custody dispute. New training required workers to treat all reports of threatened violence as credible until proven otherwise, and to prioritize children's safety over parents' rights when making placement decisions. The police department, where Jennifer had repeatedly sought help, established a specialized domestic violence unit trained to recognize the warning signs of escalating abuse. They also implemented a threat assessment protocol that flagged cases involving threats against children for immediate investigation, regardless of whether physical violence had already occurred. But perhaps the most significant change came within the legal community itself. Jennifer's case became a teaching tool in law schools and judicial training programs, used to illustrate how unconscious bias and procedural rigidity can have deadly consequences. Family law attorneys began receiving mandatory training on recognizing the signs of lethal domestic violence, and court-appointed advocates were assigned to all high-risk custody cases. The community response extended beyond legal and procedural changes. Emma, Sophie, and Grace Dean Elementary School was built in their memory, designed as a safe haven for children experiencing trauma at home. The Dean Foundation, established with donations from across the country, provides emergency financial assistance to mothers fleeing abusive relationships and funds legal advocacy for domestic violence survivors navigating custody battles. David Dean, meanwhile, sits in a maximum security prison where he will spend the rest of his life. According to correctional staff, he has never expressed remorse for murdering his daughters, maintaining that he was justified in his actions because Jennifer forced his hand by trying to take his children away. His letters to the media, which are occasionally leaked, continue to blame Jennifer for the murders he committed, showing the same lack of accountability that characterized his behavior during their marriage. The ripple effects of this case continue to spread through the legal system years after Emma, Sophie, and Grace's deaths. Other mothers facing similar situations now have legal precedents to cite when seeking protection for their children. Judges are more likely to take threats seriously, and Child Protective Services workers are trained to recognize the warning signs of impending lethal violence. Jennifer Dean continues her advocacy work, traveling across the country to speak at conferences and training seminars for legal professionals. She has testified before Congress about the need for federal reforms to family court procedures and has consulted on numerous cases where mothers are fighting to protect their children from dangerous fathers. The deaths of Emma, Sophie, and Grace Dean serve as a stark reminder that domestic violence doesn't end when victims leave their abusers. Often it escalates to its most dangerous phase. The statistics are chilling. Approximately 70% of domestic violence murders occur after the victim has left the relationship, and children are frequently used as weapons in the abuser's final act of control. Jennifer Dean's transformation from grieving mother to tireless advocate has created lasting changes that have undoubtedly saved other children's lives. The legal reforms implemented in response to her daughter's murders have been adopted by courts across the country, providing better protection for families facing similar situations. Emma's law has become a model for other states seeking to reform their family court systems. The legislation requires judges to complete specialized training on domestic violence and coercive control, establishes protocols for emergency protective measures in cases involving threats against children, and creates oversight mechanisms to ensure threats are taken seriously regardless of who reports them. The law also addresses one of the most dangerous assumptions in family court, that children are automatically better off having relationships with both parents, even when one parent poses a danger. Under the new protocols, documented threats against children or their caregivers trigger immediate safety assessments, and visitation can be suspended pending investigation rather than continuing under the assumption that accusations are false or exaggerated. Beyond legal changes, the Dean case has influenced how domestic violence is understood and addressed at every level. Medical professionals are now trained to recognize signs that children may be in danger from parents involved in custody disputes. Teachers receive education about trauma responses in children experiencing family violence. Even pediatricians ask different questions during routine checkups, looking for signs that children may be caught in the middle of dangerous family dynamics. The case has also highlighted the deadly consequences of gender bias in family court systems. Studies conducted after Emma, Sophie, and Grace's deaths revealed that mothers reporting abuse were significantly more likely to be labeled as alienating or hysterical than fathers making similar claims. This bias, often unconscious, led to children being placed in dangerous situations because courts prioritized fathers' rights over families' safety. Training programs now address these biases directly, teaching judges and court personnel to recognize their own assumptions about gender roles and parenting. Mock trials using scenarios similar to the Dean case help legal professionals understand how their decisions can have life or death consequences for the families appearing before them. For other mothers facing similar situations, Jennifer Dean's story provides both warning and hope. The warning is clear. The system's default response may not be adequate to protect children from determined abusers, and mothers must be prepared to fight harder and longer than seems fair or reasonable. But the hope lies in the changes that have been made. The increased awareness of lethal domestic violence patterns and the growing recognition that children's safety must take precedence over parental rights. The warning signs that every parent should know are now taught in schools, community centers, and parenting classes across the country. Threats to kill family members, statements about preferring death to loss of control, escalating surveillance and stalking behavior, and attempts to isolate children from protective family members are all recognized as indicators of potential lethal violence. Perhaps most importantly, the Dean case has changed how mothers' intuition and concerns are received by authority figures. The dismissive attitude that characterized Judge Whitman's response to Jennifer's warnings, treating her fears as emotional overreaction rather than credible intelligence about danger, is no longer acceptable in professional settings. Mothers' reports of escalating behavior are now treated as expert testimony about the people they know better than anyone else. The Dean Foundation continues Jennifer's work by providing immediate assistance to families in crisis. The foundation operates a 24-hour hotline staffed by advocates trained to help mothers develop safety plans for themselves and their children. They provide emergency financial assistance for legal fees, temporary housing, and other costs associated with leaving dangerous situations. Most importantly, they offer the one thing the system failed to provide Jennifer Dean: someone who believes them and takes their fears seriously. 3 daughters lost, but their mother's voice finally being heard has saved countless others. Emma Dean would be 13 now, probably interested in boys and worried about starting high school. Sophie would be 11, likely playing soccer or taking piano lessons. Grace would be 9, old enough to help care for younger children and dream about her future. Their deaths robbed the world of whatever contributions they might have made, whatever joy they might have brought to their communities, whatever families they might have created themselves. But their legacy lives on in every child who is protected by the legal reforms implemented in their memory, every mother whose warnings are taken seriously by authority figures, every family court judge who recognizes the warning signs of lethal domestic violence and acts to prevent tragedy rather than waiting for proof that comes too late. The system failed Emma, Sophie, and Grace Dean catastrophically, but their deaths have created ripple effects that will protect other children for generations to come. Their mothers' desperate pleas, finally heard too late to save them, continue to echo in courtrooms across the country, where other mothers are fighting to protect their children from similar fates. Jennifer Dean's voice, amplified by the tragedy of her loss, has become a powerful force for change in a system that once valued procedure over protection. Every speech she gives, every training session she conducts, every legislative hearing where she testifies carries the memory of 3 little girls, whose deaths could have been prevented if just one person in authority had listened to their mother's warnings and acted to protect them. That's the ultimate lesson of this case. When women say they're afraid, when mothers report that their children are in danger, when victims of domestic violence warn that their abusers are escalating toward lethal violence, we must listen. We must believe them. And we must act quickly enough to prevent tragedy rather than simply documenting it after it's too late. If you believe, like thousands of other viewers, that Emma, Sophie, and Grace Dean's story must never be forgotten, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to be alerted when we release our next investigation into how the system fails the families it's supposed to protect. Our upcoming video examines the case of another mother whose warnings were dismissed as parental alienation until her ex-husband made good on his threats. But this time, there was a survivor who could testify about what really happened behind closed doors. It's a story that will shake your faith in family court systems and show you exactly what warning signs to watch for in your own community. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these critical stories to light, ensuring that victims like Emma, Sophie, and Grace are never forgotten, and that their deaths serve as warnings that could save other families from similar tragedies. Together, we can make sure that no mother's desperate pleas fall on deaf ears again, and that the changes made in these children's memory continue to protect the innocent for generations to come.